I've been growing onions for many years, and it's usually a productive and resilient crop for me, especially when grown from spring planted sets. But this season I was quite disappointed by the yield and quality of many of the onions that I grew. I had planted the same batch of sets on the same day in 7 different areas of the gardens, but got really divergent results. I'm quite intrigued by the reasons why this would have happened, and it seems that there's a number of different overlapping issues. The worst results came from the sets that I planted in the new polytunnel of the black plot. This is usually quite a successful crop when grown under the protection of plastic, with higher yields, faster growth, and an earlier harvest, but I was really disappointed by this batch. Part of this is likely due to the poor soil fertility in this garden, an issue that I'm working to fix, and it also probably contributed to the bad case of downy mildew that hit the entire crop. But probably the biggest factor was my failure to weed enough, which caused these onions to suffer from some serious competition. I just didn't give this crop enough attention, which is really disappointing, especially as these onions took up an entire bed of this really high value growing space. The spring planted onions in the extensive, intensive, and no-dig gardens all did very badly, with less than 30% of the yield that I was able to get last year, and worse than any year I have records for. It seems that weather was one of the biggest factors here, as we had a cold and wet spring with strong winds that caused a lot of damage to the leaves, and all of this seems to have contributed to really bad cases of downy mildew, and then suddenly the weather transitioned to a really dry period. All of this was exacerbated by some weed pressure as I struggled to keep up with these regular tasks with all the extra watering I was doing. The weeds would have caused increased competition for nutrients and water, but I can't discount the possibility of issues with the overall fertility, as I suspect there are some deficiencies in the soil of each of these gardens. The batch of onions that I planted outside in the black plot had similar issues with weeds, but because it was in a more sheltered location, they weren't damaged as much by the winds in the spring. But I didn't water these onions at all, even during the extended dry period, so I was a little bit surprised when the average size of the bulbs and the overall yield that was harvested from this batch was on par with the other 3 gardens that I did water. There may have been slightly better soil fertility or slightly less weed pressure at critical times in the development, or it's possible that onions just don't need so much water after they reach a certain stage in their development. But whatever the factors involved, I was still disappointed in the harvest. On the basis of these 4 outside gardens, I would probably mostly blame the weather for the poor yields, but the onions growing in the simple and polyculture gardens went against this trend. While the harvest from the simple garden was less than it was last year, the drop wasn't nearly as much as it was for the other gardens. The kilogram per square meter yield of onions from the simple garden was more than twice the average of the other 4 outside gardens, and more than 60% higher than from the intensive garden. And the individual onions were on average more than twice the size of what was produced in the other 4 gardens. Perhaps this was due to this batch being slightly more sheltered from the wind, or perhaps there was better soil quality and fertility, but I suspect that the main reason is that there were substantially fewer weeds, even if I wasn't so attentive with my weeding. The garden bed that these onions were grown in had been fully prepared in the autumn and then covered with a ground cover fabric through the winter and right up until just before the sets were planted in the spring, and I think this helped a lot with the weed issues. In a similar way, the bed in the polyculture garden was much more thoroughly weeded while the onions were growing in order to prepare the soil for a broadcast sowing of carrots and parsnip in amongst the onions and garlic. The late spring also meant that I delayed this intercrop sowing of carrot and parsnip, which effectively gave much more space to each of the garlic and onion plants while they were actively growing than they would have had in any of the other gardens. This extra space meant a bigger root zone with more food, less competition, and less stress, and this really seemed to have made a difference in what was otherwise a tough year for this crop. It's difficult to compare the yield from the polyculture garden with the other gardens, as all the plants are mixed in together. But even if you ignore the fact that these onions were sharing the same space with garlic and then carrots and parsnip, the kilogram per square meter yield was slightly less than the simple garden, but still more than the other outside gardens. It's interesting to compare the number of onions that I harvested to the number of sets that I planted at the beginning of the season, and it's been a lower percentage this year than it has been in recent years. Part of this is due to some of the onions rotting at their base where they touch the soil, which seems to be a weather-related issue that was common to all the gardens. Another factor is when the sets themselves are actually removed from the soil. This can happen by the young developing roots pushing the set right out of the soil, and it seems to have happened more this year than in previous years, and perhaps I just didn't plant them deep enough. In the past, I've had lots of sets pulled out of the soil, and I suspect that birds have done this. So now I make sure that I cover all of the sets for at least the first few weeks in order to prevent this. But I noticed something really strange in the simple garden this year. A lot of the sets were pulled out of the ground and clustered together, as if something was collecting them. But this was under a crop cover, and so it couldn't have been birds. I can only suspect that it was a mouse or a rat or perhaps even a hedgehog, but I still have no idea why it would have done this. Having to replant the sets would of course delay the start of the growth of the onion, and any roots that were developing would probably be damaged as I push the set back into the soil, which would likely cause stress for the plant for the rest of the growing season. All of this would have reduced the size and number of onions harvested from all of the gardens. But if it hadn't been for the strange pest behavior in the simple garden, the yield from this garden might have been even higher. Perhaps it's not really fair to compare the spring planted crops that were grown outside to a crop of overwintering onions that I planted in the shelter of the polytunnel garden. Overwintering in this kind of shelter during the typically mild Irish winter offers plants many opportunities to grow. The extra warmth and the lack of wind usually lead to bigger and earlier harvests. But this season I also had good weed control, enough watering for the most part, and really good soil fertility. All of this enabled me to harvest 10.5 kilograms of onions from each square meter of bed, which is more than 2.5 times the yield of the simple garden and more than 7 times the yield of the extensive and no-dig garden this season. It also produced quite large bulbs, despite the intensive planting with sets spaced quite close together. It may not be a fair comparison, but it's really useful for me to be aware of how good a crop can get, given the right conditions. This season has also been an interesting lesson in how poorly crops can grow, given a combination of poor weather, inadequate weeding, and fertility not being as good as it should be. And this year I've had the full range of results from really poor to some of the best onions I've ever grown. And there's lots of learning possibilities from all of it. One of the great parts of this Red Gardens project is being able to grow the same crop in multiple different gardens. And when things go poorly, it's often a more valuable learning experience than when things go well. Although I'd rather only share my successes, I think it's important to share and explore the reasons why things didn't go as planned. That's a really important part of this YouTube channel. If you appreciate this approach, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page linked here or in the description below. Any contribution you make will help me to continue with this fascinating project, but more importantly, thank you for watching.